Today on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Ferrum College, one of the leading scholars on early Christian apocryphal literature and author of the Magi, who they were, how they've been remembered, and why they still fascinate. Dr. Vanden Eykel has spent his career studying the texts that didn't make it into your Bible, but shaped almost everything you believe about the stories that did. The three kings at the manger, not in scripture. Mary's backstory, written by a 2nd century author most Christians have never heard of. The childhood of Jesus, filled in by writers who gave him powers that would shock most churchgoers today. The nativity scene you picture every December is a Christmas story built from sources the church never canonized. And Dr. Vanden Eykel knows exactly where every piece came from. This is a conversation about the Gospels early Christians wish existed, the questions the New Testament refused to answer, and the writers who took it upon themselves to answer them anyway. Now, it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, and today, my guest, Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel. Dr. Vanden Eykel, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to have a great conversation. Yeah,
looking forward to it. Thanks for the invitation.
My pleasure. All right, let's get in. The canonical Gospels give us almost nothing about Jesus's birth and childhood. Why were early Christians so unsatisfied with that silence, and what were they trying to solve by writing new stories?
Yeah, I mean, the story of Jesus's birth is found in the New Testament only in Matthew and Luke. And the stories are, especially in Matthew, the story is just really, really slim on details. And Luke, you get some sort of different details, a different angle. In Matthew, Joseph is the one who's talking with everyone, the angels, and Joseph is the one who knows what's going on. And then in Luke, it's Mary who knows what's going on. So I think, the reason why these stories were kind of maybe unsettling and prompted people to rewrite them is precisely because they're not super detailed. And there's all sorts of conclusions that early Christians are drawing about the person of Jesus. And as they're drawing those conclusions, and as they're kind of thinking more about who they believe Jesus to be, they kind of naturally start to retell these stories, and they begin filling out details. They start to try and harmonize some details. A great example of this is, in Matthew and Luke, Jesus is born in Bethlehem in both stories. And that's important for both of these authors, but it's really, really a kind of different ways of making sure that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, right? And in Matthew, that's just where his parents live. And in Luke, they live in Nazareth, and so they go to Bethlehem for this census. So, the early Christians, as they're thinking about these stories, they're kind of trying to reconcile those things, and they're trying to figure out, how do these stories fit together. And in that process, they also kind of have to add details. They have to change details to make them make sense.
I think Christian, and I'm a Christian. I'm a pastor. I run a church here in Long Island, New York. I see so many things that it's very ironic. One of those things you just mentioned is a great point, was that I don't think Christians really know or notice how much of what they believe really is not in the scripture as they think it is. I remember as a young Christian, the Bible says, and then trying to find it, I'm like, well, that's a bit of a stretch from this one thing,
Yeah. No, and I always tell my students the thing that'll make me bristle more quickly than pretty much anything is the statement the Bible says, because the Bible is a collection of texts from different authors, and so it says different things depending on which author you're looking at.
The Proto-Evangelium of James. I'm going to go with PJ for the rest of this conversation here. Mm-hmm. But I do know that this is one of the most influential Christian texts that most Christians have never heard of. What is it, and what does it claim about Mary?
Yeah, so the Proto-Evangelium, it receives this title in the 16th century when it's kind of rediscovered. It is a text that sort of falls out of favor in the West. So we have very few Latin copies of this text, but it is a text that is kind of rediscovered and reintroduced into European consciousness in the 1500s. And the text it's just really a fascinating text. And you're absolutely right. It's one of the most influential collections of stories that most Christians today aren't really aware of. Although there's plenty of art that kind of taps into the Proto-Evangelium so Christians who are going to church in Europe are seeing images of characters from this text. Mary is the protagonist, or she's the sort of central character, and the one of the details we get from this text are, who were her parents, Joachim and Anna. These are people who don't appear in the New Testament, and they get full on lives in the Proto-Evangelium. So this is a text that was written in Greek. It is a second century text, so it's extremely early. And I tend to date it in the first part of the second century, so like probably around 150 or maybe slightly before, but sometime in the second century. And this collection of stories is very much focused on answering this question of, okay, so early Christians have sort of arrived at this conclusion. They're worshiping Jesus as a God, and the Proto-Evangelium is a collection of stories that sort of try to answer this question of, well, okay, if Jesus was a God in human form and he was born, what does that look like? What was his mother like? And it's a very, very reasonable question. What sort of person gives birth to a God? And so the Proto-Evangelium starts even before Mary's birth. It starts with her parents, and it's patterned off the story of, or this part of the text is patterned off the story of Samuel in the Old Testament. The story of the kind of miraculous conception of Samuel by Anna. Hannah. It's Anna in the proto-gospel, but Hannah. And so it kind of follows that, there's this pious couple that doesn't have a child. And then suddenly an angel appears and says, you will have a child. And that child is Mary. And so the really cool thing about this text, though, is it sort of follows Mary's story. It starts before her conception, and then it follows all the way through her birth, her infancy, and ultimately, she is brought to the temple when she's 3 years old, and she lives in the temple until she's 12, and she kind of dwells in the Holy of Holies. Angels bring her food. Really, really fascinating stuff, and just kind of tries to fill out that portrait of the assumption that this woman would have been spectacular in so many ways. So let's tell some stories. Let's collect some stories and see, what was she really like, and what do we believe about her?
Man, that's fascinating. Who do we know who wrote it?
Well, it claims to be James, the brother of Jesus, or the stepbrother of Jesus in this text. But it's likely, I mean, that's an attempt of the author probably to push the text a little earlier. So to sort of give the impression that it was written even before the Gospels were. But we more or less conclude that it was just probably an anonymous author or authors in the second century.
Gotcha. And that changes also the concept of Mary just being this like ordinary girl who had no, idea of who she was. And then this angel visits her in the middle of the night. Hey, you're going to give birth to Messiah, God in flesh. Seems like she was special from her childhood.
Yes, well, and even before, right, and that's that kind of feeds into the what would then develop into things like the Immaculate Conception in Roman Catholic belief, whereas Mary is a sinless creature, and she is sinless from the moment of her conception. The Proto-Gospel doesn't actually say this, but it is very, very clear that Mary's mother conceives Mary in the absence of a father. Her father is off fasting in the wilderness when Anna becomes pregnant with Mary. And so the point of the text is that, this is not just a random person that God has chosen to carry himself, basically. But this is somebody who has been part of this plan that is driven by God and has been part of this plan really before they even existed.
How much of what Christians believe about Mary today actually comes from this second century text rather than the Bible itself?
I would say a pretty good amount of it. This, at least in sort of Catholic circles and Orthodox circles, I would say a lot of Mariology and beliefs about Mary takes root in this text. Specifically, the sort of set apart nature of Mary. She's not just a random person; she's somebody that God not only chose but really designed for this purpose.
The proto-evangelium, I think I got it right that time.
Yes, yes,
The one thing I noticed when reviewing this text was that it goes to great lengths to defend Mary's virginity.
yes.
Why was that such a pressing concern for second century Christians, really just Christianity in general?
Yeah. Well, and of course, Matthew and Luke both are not subtle about this. Matthew and Luke both believe that Mary's conception of Jesus was virginal, and that kind of taps into the idea in the ancient world that's this idea that important people also have important childhoods, important births, and these sorts of things. You see this in other stories. Alexander the Great's conception is one example, right? Alexander's father comes in and his wife, he sees his wife at some point, has this vision of her like lying in bed with a snake, and he sort of like leaves. He's like, no, thanks. And then she sort of appears pregnant with Alexander the Great. So it's a pretty common trope in the ancient world of not necessarily virginal conceptions, but miraculous conceptions. And so that is sort of there in Matthew and Luke. But by the time you get to the second century, there's a bit of rhetoric that's coming from sort of non-Christian or perhaps even anti-Christian circles that says, no, Mary was not, Mary did not conceive Jesus virginally. And if Joseph wasn't the father, somebody else had to have been the father. And so there develops this kind of tradition. The most common iteration of this tradition is that Mary is the victim of assault by a Roman soldier. I mean, this Roman soldier even gets a name in the tradition, Pantera. And so the proto-gospel, one interpretation of it is that this story is meant to counter those claims about Mary, that Mary was somehow, assaulted, raped, and that's where Jesus comes from. And so the proto-gospel pushes back and says, no, she was under the care of her parents. She was under the care of the temple, and then ultimately tells the story of her divine conception. It fills in a lot of those details that are absent from Matthew and Luke to sort of assure readers, no, she absolutely was a virgin when she conceived. And so it kind of tries to bolster that claim and fill it out a little bit that's already present in Matthew and Luke.
Yeah, I'm curious because obviously we know the prophecies of Messiah born of a virgin, so they're trying to protect that. I'm assuming, but also, I guess maybe you probably wouldn't even know. My question is why? Like, why couldn't God just have a husband and a wife or a married couple give birth to Messiah? Like, are they just trying to add to the supernatural element of what is going on here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it ultimately boils down to, if you have a belief that is articulated and a belief that is being held to about the person of Mary. And in the second century, I mean, Mary is obviously, the proto-gospel, the proto-evangelium is proof of this, that Mary in the second century has been elevated to this status of a kind of herself a miraculous creature. And so if you already have that belief, later debates, I'm thinking especially of Thomas Aquinas, although I can't cite you a place from the Summa that he says this, but there is this kind of like, could God have created Jesus from kind of normal sexual relationships? Yes, absolutely, 100%. God can do whatever God wants, but there's this sense, again, with at least with later debates that I think are probably present even earlier. There is this sense that, well, yes, God could have done it this other way, but God did it this way, and so they're sort of like trying to construct a system wherein that truth claim is still solid.
Gotcha. All right, let's go to another topic that you have a book on, the Magi. Um,
Yes.
most people assume they were kings and that their names were Gaspar, Melchior, Balthasar. None of that, their names specifically, are in the Bible. Where did all of that come from?
Yeah, so this is another great example of it's always it's always good to talk about the Magi when it's not even Magi season.
I know. I was going to say I should have saved this episode for Christmas.
Well, it's I mean it's and I mean as the old saying goes, it's always Magi season somewhere. At least that's the saying in my house. No, I think the Magi are really a fascinating example. This story in Matthew that's basically 12 verses in length, and like the story of Jesus's birth more broadly, it's super vague and it lacks in detail. And so only in Matthew are these characters do these characters appear in the New Testament. And yeah, when you go back and read the story away from any kind of preconceived notions about who they are, what they are, why they're there, all of that. When you go back and read the story, it's just very, very short. And there's all these questions that get left, right? They come from the east. Well, where is that? And how many are there? Matthew never actually says that there are three Magi, even though that kind of gets picked up pretty early. I mean, with a good reason. I mean, there's three gifts, probably three givers. But no, the kind of impulse to retell this story is not only because it's a really kind of interesting and mysterious story, but because people have the desire to fill in these gaps and to say, well, if these are important characters, where did they come from and why are they really there? Because Matthew never really says, why are they there? They just say, we're looking for the one born king of the Judeans. And, we saw his star. So we came here and we want to pay tribute to him. But why? Like, what's the rationale? And so that kind of gives rise to this whole interpretive tradition of, they're coming to Jesus, because they're pagans who are in need of deliverance from evil, or all sorts of different reasons. And there's all these different stories that develop in the wake of Matthew's story that kind of try to fill in those gaps. And because there's so many of them, those stories often take these kind of different trajectories of who are they, why are they there, what sorts of conversations do they have, and they kind of culminate. The sort of pinnacle of this, in my mind, is a text called the Revelation of the Magi, which is written in Syriac, probably 8th century or so. And in this text, I mean, they are there's multiple Magi. There's 12 Magi, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And they, there's all sorts of discourse, and the story is told from their perspective. So it's really, really fascinating how these early authors retell and try to kind of fill in the gaps of that story.
Is that really where they got three from? They assumed three gifts, three. So they must each holding the. I mean, I don't know, man. I bring in groceries in my house,
Yeah.
and I try.
Yeah.
I'm one of those guys that tries to get them all in one shot, so I don't have to make a double trip.
Mhm.
I feel like
right.
one could carry three. Is that really where they got three from?
I mean, so the word Magi implies that there's more than one because it's a plural. But yeah, the story in Matthew just says, Magi from the east brought frankincense, gold, and myrrh. And the sort of conclusion, I think a lot of this comes from the kind of assumption of like each one would have had one gift. And I mean, truthfully, I think that's a pretty fair assumption. I think Matthew probably does imagine three characters, but he never actually says that. So perhaps there were a bunch who were, the example I use a lot is, when you go to a baby shower and there's, 20 people but there's only three gifts. There's, diapers, wipes, and clothes or whatever.
Right.
But the 20 people all bring the same three gifts.
Gotcha. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then of course in art, this is one of the big influences that kind of solidifies not only the number of the Magi, or really the number of the Magi gets solidified in art because they sort of, three is a nice number for early Christians. And the earliest artistic representations we have almost always have three. And so that sort of gets codified. And then later, probably 6th century around, it is when they inherit these names, which then also become sort of part of the tradition.
Where did the names come from? Do we know where that kind of how they got assigned to them?
That's a little bit of a mystery. The first written text that I'm aware of that lists their names is Excerpta Latin Barbari. It's a really, really strange text that kind of just enumerates them as having these different names. But then there's also a mosaic in Ravenna in Italy that is around probably slightly after that also has their name. So I think it's just sort of um, the names kind of just arise out of tradition, but the fifth, sixth century is the earliest that we see evidence of those names.
Yeah, even in Christianity, the three are now turning into groups. So a lot more teachings are there were multiple, and even the
Hmm.
length of time. Because can a kid growing up, you sit there, it's like, oh, the three wise men, they come over and give gifts to Jesus, and you think like, oh, it just took a couple hours to walk over to Christ and
Right.
give gifts instead of these the long time, months and months and months. Um,
Right. Right.
I know you've argued the Magi and Matthew are political figures associated with
Yes.
power and not mystical gift bearers. How does that reframe what Matthew's actually talking about or doing here?
Yeah, so that's my central argument in the book is that these, I think when you look at the reception history of this passage, it very much, very early and almost universally goes to this idea that the Magi are sort of Gentiles who are coming to worship Jesus, and then that becomes in interpretation of Matthew, a foreshadowing of Jewish rejection of Jesus. And that certainly does happen in Matthew. Whether that is a historical reality or not is probably a longer conversation. But I push back on that interpretation because I just don't really see it in Matthew. I don't think these characters are there for worship. I think Matthew is using them in order to highlight the illegitimacy of Herod's kingship and the legitimacy of Jesus's kingship. So, Matthew goes to great length in his genealogy that he starts out his gospel with by saying, Jesus is descended from David. And I mean, he's not subtle about any of this, right? David, David, David. And then, and the Magi are useful for him because in the ancient world, one of the primary functions of Magi is they serve as advisors to kings, and so this is, and so they're drawn to kind of the courts of kings, and they're drawn to political power, and so I think Matthew is using this story. I think Matthew kind of brings the Magi in. He has them go to Jerusalem to ask Herod first, because they're looking for the king of the Judeans, and so this is the obvious place where they would go. And in Matthew, it's very clear they've gone to the wrong place, because when they go to Jerusalem and they say, we're looking for the one born king of the Judeans, Herod has to admit, well, that's not me. And so then they send them to Bethlehem instead. And that's where they then open their chests and they present their gifts of tributes. And so this, in my mind, this entire story is centered on affirming for readers that Jesus is the true heir to David's throne, not Herod. And then kind of by association there, it casts shade on the Roman Empire, because Herod receives his title, King of the Judeans, from the Senate in Rome, but Herod is not even himself a Judean. And so it kind of tries to reset and say, no, this is not there. We don't have allegiance to this kind of puppet king of Rome. Jesus is the true king. And that kingship obviously looks different because this king gets crucified by Rome, not rubber stamped.
Right. Can we just define the Magi a little bit here, right? Because
Mhm.
you go from wise men to kings,
Right.
magicians.
Yes.
Who are these people? Who, like, a specific, like, you say they're political, but do they have this supernatural or magical aura to their character?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They so Magi in the ancient world, really the only translation of Magi that I kind of say, like, let's find something else, is kings. Kings is one of those things that's like, I'm not really sure that's what Matthew has in mind. Although there are characters in the in ancient literature who are identified as sort of trained Magi as a precursor for being a king, but kind of different roles. The figure of the magus in the ancient world is a very It's very, very subjective. It really kind of depends on who you're asking. If you say, what is a magus? If you ask Matthew, what is a magus? I mean, in my mind, this is a advisory figure who is coming to pay tribute to this king. If you look elsewhere in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, there are two magi who appear in the book of Acts. One is named Simon and one is named Elymas. And also in that story called Bar Jesus. And in both of these stories, Magi are negative characters. Like, these are not good characters. And so Matthew kind of likes Magi, or at least tolerates them, and Luke hates them. Luke is or Luke being the likely author of Acts. I skipped ahead there a little bit, but in the ancient world, I mean, that's when we look at Magi and the functions that they serve, political functions, but they're also in a lot of texts, they're trained religious professionals. So they are priestly figures, and they interpret dreams. They interpret other phenomena, earthquakes, fires, these sorts of things. They perform sacrifices. Zoroastrians refer to many of their religious professionals as Magi. And so there is a very religious dimension and a kind of, I would say, mysterious dimension to them, right? These are powerful figures who have the ability to discern the will of the gods, and who have the ability to kind of see things that normal people like us can't see because we're not trained to.
Right. Once the Magi story left Matthew's hands, it kind of took on a life of its own, kind of. How did later writers expand this narrative, and what were they adding that Matthew never intended, in your opinion?
Well, so one of the things that happens in a lot of later texts is there's lots of things that happen in later texts. One of the really notable things that happens is a fixation on the star in Matthew, and sort of what exactly are we dealing with here when we're dealing with the star? Because in Matthew, the star kind of has two different personalities. In the first part of the story of the Magi, it's sort of just a regular star that the Magi have discerned some significance from. And so they say, we saw his star at its rising. And this is tapping into the belief in the ancient world that rising stars are linked to rising rulers. And you see in Isaiah, falling stars are also linked to falling rulers. And the most famous example of this is in Isaiah 14, I believe it is the king of Babylon, right? You are fallen, O day star, son of the morning. And so that sort of idea that when the star falls, the king has fallen out of favor, and when a star rises, the king is sort of coming into being. But in Matthew's story, the first part anyway, it really does seem like a regular star, and that's why it's the Magi who are the ones who are interpreting it, right? Nobody else can sort of tell that this star is any different. But then in the second part of Matthew's story, the star reappears when they leave Jerusalem, and then at that point, the star is actually leading them. It's sort of a different phenomenon, almost like a homing beacon of some sort, right? It moves on before them. They're happy to see it, and it stops over the house where Jesus is. The stars don't do that. And so early Christians are kind of trying to think about the star and saying, okay, so what exactly is this star? In the proto-gospel, one of the things that happens with the star is that it becomes exceedingly bright, like bright to the point where all of the other stars dim and you can't even see any of them, which I think sort of is a way of saying, yeah, it was an unusual star, but then also it taps into that political rhetoric of Jesus's kingship has not only begun, but it's more significant than all of the other kingships that we kind of know of. So expansions on the star is one of the big things. And then also expansions on just the backstory of the Magi. In the revelation of the Magi, these characters are hanging out way in the east in the land of Shir, which is kind of near the boundaries of the earth, and they're waiting. They're waiting for the arrival of a sign from heaven that sort of shows them that God is going to, restore creation to the way that it was supposed to function. And then when this star appears, it's actually not a star, it's actually Jesus himself. And so it's a kind of shape-shifting, it appears, it speaks to them, it leads them, it makes meals for them, it levels mountains, all of those sorts of things. So kind of just filling in those details and almost kind of adding to the mysterious and legendary nature of the story.
Gotcha. Gotcha. All right. Let's talk about some of the additional texts, apocrypha, things like that. The infancy gospel of Thomas has
Mm,
a child Jesus cursing kids, causing death, raising
hmm
them back. What are the
hmm
purpose of stories like this in the
Man,
infancy gospel of Thomas?
infancy gospel of Thomas is every single New Testament's favorite, every single New Testament scholar's favorite thing to teach in class, because we give this text to students and they come to class and they're like, so raise your hand if you were surprised not only that Jesus causes death, but that he literally like strikes people dead as a child. And this is, it's an absolutely wild text. Now I am not an expert in this text. I dabble in this text, but I love this text. In fact, if I had to go back and write a kind of intellectual biography of what first really planted the seed for me to kind of focus on apocryphal literature in my studies, I encountered this text in a New Testament class when I was in college, and I read it and went, "Oh my gosh, this is crazy!" It's really really fascinating. But
Yeah.
it's the same kind of thing that we see with these other texts. We see the desire to understand something about Jesus's life. And the New Testament does not tell us hardly anything about Jesus's childhood. In Matthew, we have, Jesus grows up in Egypt because Joseph gets scared of Herod and scared of Jesus being targeted by Herod. So he moves everyone to Egypt, and that kind of takes Jesus off the map a little bit. In Luke, we get this one story of Jesus as a 12-year-old in the temple who is, chatting with the rabbis. This is the story of subpar parenting on Mary and Joseph's part, right? Where they leave, they go to Jerusalem for Passover, and then they leave, and 3 days later they just 3 days later they discover that Jesus is not, you just see this happening, right? Like
Father of the
Joseph and
year,
Mary look
gone.
like,
That's it.
they're like, I thought you had him, right? Like this is a communication issue, right? You need to, as a friend of mine says, like for any marriage to work, you have to communicate clearly and often. 3 days without knowing where your kid is. But anyway, but that is the only story really that we have in the New Testament about Jesus as a kid.
Yeah.
And so at some point somebody said, well, we're going to tell what Jesus was like as a kid. And so the infancy gospel of Thomas starts out with Jesus as a 5-year-old playing by a river, separating out waters into pools, cleansing them by his word, making little clay. It's just a fascinating. It's also a theologically loaded text, right? Because this is, Jesus gathering waters. This is what God does in Genesis, right? God gathers the waters and creates animals out of clay, right? Jesus is doing the creative work that God has done in Genesis, which is the author's way of saying this child is not just a child. This is a divine child. Well, then the kind of logical, in my mind, the logical place that this text goes, if you've ever spent any time around a 5-year-old, then you know exactly what I'm about to say. What would it look like if you had a child who was God with unlimited power? What would that child look like as a 5-year-old? And frankly, I mean, Jesus fits the mold, right? If somebody bumps into him, he strikes them dead. He withers them, right? And he gets upset. And so this whole text though is really an interesting kind of commentary on, the power of God. And also it sort of acknowledges that Jesus has a very profound human component to him as well, right? This is not just a divine being. This is also a human who had to learn how to be a human. So there's all sorts of interesting kind of thoughts about why this story exists. I think one of the most compelling arguments, though, is that I don't think this author believed that they were telling a story about how Jesus used to be, a violent, cursing, wonder worker. I think that this author believes that Jesus as a child was a cursing wonder worker, but that also he was a cursing wonder worker as an adult. You see these the best example of this that I can that comes to mind is the story of Jesus and the fig tree in the Gospel of Mark, right? He sees this fig tree, he goes up to it, tries to find figs, and there's no figs. And then he curses it, but the author says it wasn't the season for figs. So he goes up to this tree expecting fruit when it's not even time for fruit, and the fig tree withers. That's not reasonable, right? That's not a reasonable thing. And so that author kind of takes that story and says, well, what would this person look like when they were a child? Assuming that great people have kind of more static character traits in the ancient world.
Gotcha. Yeah, it really sounds like a kid figuring out, whoa, I got all that. Let me kill you, raise you. Let me kill you, raise you.
Yeah.
Let me kill you, raise you. Like, oh,
Yeah.
I can do all this. Look what I can do with the water. Look what I can do with this.
Right. And like, there's this one part where Joseph is like, Joseph is throughout this text is kind of wringing his hands because the parents from the town are coming and being like, hey, you have to get him under control. He's killing our children. This is a line from the text, And so there's one point where Joseph like hires a tutor for him, and Jesus curses this tutor because the tutor doesn't respect his intellect or whatever. But the story, the collection of stories in the infancy Thomas are also fascinating because they're balanced, right? Like, when does Jesus kill people? Well, he kills people when they are not praising him, when they are not telling him how good he is, and and also literally when they get in his way and he bumps into them. And then there's also these stories of, when Jesus is in a good place, he's also helpful, right? So when Joseph is in his workshop and he cuts a piece of wood and it's too short, Jesus like lengthens the board for him. And, Mary asks him to go and get water, and he like brings back a cloak full of water. So he's also very helpful as long as you're respecting him. That's also a theological commentary, I think.
So I would understand why this text would be removed from the canon, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
But it is very clear, even in the New Testament, that there are so many texts and scriptures that were extremely important to the early Christians. They're quoted in the New Testament plenty of times, over and over and over again. Why didn't they, and I know this is a very general statement, why do you think some of them did not make it into the New Testament? Was there just the dramatic rejection of this, or is this, I guess the story could be more complicated than that?
Yeah, the process of canonization is one that really is, we have some details and we have a lot of educated guesses on how this process actually happens. I am of the mind, when we talk about canonization and the kind of determining what's in the New Testament, what's not, I tend to think of this as a very organic process. I tend to think of this as starting from the perspective of, first of all, is the text about Jesus? And if it's not, like the proto-gospel is extremely, extremely popular, the proto-evangelium, but it's not really focused on Jesus, and therefore it sort of doesn't have a natural home in the New Testament. The infancy gospel of Thomas, however, is very much about Jesus. So why is that not in there? Well, there's two reasons for that. First of all, at some point, people are not reading it quite as frequently as they're reading other texts, because of the disturbing details. There's plenty of early Christians with good reason who don't like the idea of Jesus, murdering people, murdering other children, even though he resurrects them as well in this story. But no, I think that one of the primary things that we have to think about when we think about what texts are included and what aren't is their circulation and how popular they were. Texts like the infancy gospel of Thomas, those texts are circulating. We have copies of them, but then there's other texts, like one text that's very, very popular today that people like to talk about is just the Gospel of Thomas. And it's not the same thing as the infancy gospel, but the Gospel of Thomas is this collection of really quite bizarre sayings of Jesus. And we don't have that many copies of the Gospel of Thomas from the ancient world, which shows us that it wasn't circulating probably as widely as other texts. And it wasn't circulating because there wasn't as much of a demand for it. And there wasn't a demand for it because people weren't reading it. And so we have to think about the way that texts propagated in the ancient world. And there weren't people who were sitting there saying, let's make there weren't publishing operations. I mean, there were publishing operations, but they look different, right? If you want a copy of a book, you have to go track down a person who has a copy of that book, and then you have to hire somebody to copy that book for you. And so if you're probably not going to be seeking out a copy of the Gospel of Thomas because it's a slog. It's really, really confusing. It's not all that easy to read, but you are going to be tracking down texts like the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke, because these are the ones that you're hearing, oh, these are really good. So you're gonna naturally go and kind of get copies of that.
Were these apocryphal texts solving theological problems? And the canonical gospels accidentally created me. I know everybody, you got to think like who's writing the text. They're coming from a lens, they're coming from a framework. There is a bias from everything, right? Like we read the gospels, we got this, from the perspective of the believers of Christ. But I'm sure there's a flip side of that coin. If the Romans were writing about the same experiences, they would probably have a much different approach to it than the gospel writers were. So were these apocryphal texts trying to solve some problem? Like, oh man, we have some missing gaps here. Let's try to fill them in with whatever.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the question, do they solve theological problems? I think they seek out, I think a lot of them try to solve theological problems. And by doing so, they also create a lot of theological problems.
Right.
And so, the coming back to the Proto-Evangelium, right? That is a text that is trying to kind of solve the problem of, Mary's purity, Mary's virginity, those sorts of things, and making sure that those are, that story kind of supplements what we find in the Gospels to say, a person who has the proto-gospel who's also reading Luke is going to say, aha, I know this backstory. And so it sort of aims to kind of bolster the claims that those texts are making. And sometimes, though, the details that they include, for example, the episode that I noted where when the angel comes to Mary in the Proto-Evangelium and says, behold, you are with child, right? You are pregnant. You have conceived, like already. Her husband is gone at this point. Like he is in the desert. And so it's very, very clear that this text sets up a miraculous conception for Mary, a divine conception even. And so the point of that is to say, well, Mary was, this pure creature, but then it sort of creates this theological problem of, well, if Jesus's divine virginal conception is also something that Mary herself shares, well, then what do we do with that, right? And so that is a theological problem that's kind of created by that text, but it's only created by that text in light of texts like Matthew and Luke.
Right. You co-edited a volume on Judeophobia and the New Testament. How did some of those non-canonical expansions contribute to anti-Jewish sentiment in early Christianity?
Yeah, so that's a book that we're really, really happy to see out in the world, and it's already doing good work, I hope. But yeah, one of the themes that I looked at in my book on the Magi was how interpretations of Matthew, specifically patristic and these apocryphal texts, how they kind of give rise to anti-Judaism, or what we call Judeophobia, as a kind of broader umbrella. And I think one of the ways that they do this is by really kind of leaning into the idea that the Magi are sort of taking the focus off the Magi as Magi and putting the focus on the Magi as pious Gentiles. And again, that's a dynamic that I just don't really see in Matthew, but it's certainly the way that a lot of people interpreted that text very early on, is to say, like, well, the Magi are the good Gentiles, and they're going up in Jerusalem against the quote unquote bad Jews. And so, this text and others contribute to that portrait of, early on, they sort of narrativize the Jewish rejection of Jesus that becomes so prominent in texts like Matthew, right? At the end of Matthew, the Jewish crowd that's gathered when Jesus is before Pilate, that crowd is saying, crucify him. And then Pilate's like, I want nothing to do with this. And then the Jewish crowd says what are perhaps the most dangerous words in the New Testament: his blood be on us and on our children. And that has disastrous consequences it still has disastrous consequences, right? This idea that the Jews killed Jesus, or that the Jews are responsible for killing Jesus. And in Matthew, this idea that they take full responsibility for that guilt. Now, I want to pause for legal reasons and say that is a position that I fully reject. I think that this is harmful rhetoric that Matthew is using here, but I think that rhetoric gets read back into the Magi story, and it just kind of strengthens that claim that not only did the Jews reject Jesus at his crucifixion, but they reject him even from the moment of his birth, which then again has very, very disastrous consequences.
Gotcha. We're going to link both the books that we mentioned today on the Magi and the Judeo book in the description of the episode on YouTube and on Apple, Spotify. We just got a few more questions. It's been an amazing conversation. So again, definitely appreciate all the wisdom here, and my lessons on pronunciations over here have been just tremendous. How much of the Christmas story, as most Christians know it, is actually a composite that doesn't exist in a text? I know this is similar to what we there, but again, I just don't think we fully grasp how much of what we celebrate or what we believe as the whole story, how much of that is gaps that are filled in.
Yeah, no, the nativity that sits on your mantle at Christmas time, or that appears in front of the church, is itself a kind of non-canonical text of a sort. I know. It is. I'm glad I was glad you're sitting down for this. No, I mean that is, it's still, but it's the way that we make sense of things. It's not to say like, Christians are stupid in some way. It's just to say like, this is the natural consequence of reading, right? Matthew gives us certain details. Matthew gives us the detail of the Magi and the star, and Luke gives us the detail of the journey to Bethlehem to register in this census of Luke's, but the journey to Bethlehem, and also from Luke we also get the detail of the stable. Now, I also want to be very clear: the stable is not in Luke. The stable is a detail that is provided by the reader's imagination. And if anyone watching this is thinking, no, I don't know, I remember a stable in Luke. There is no stable in Luke. There's also no innkeeper in Luke. But the Christmas story includes these details because we fill in the gaps naturally. Well, where does the stable come from? Well, Jesus and Luke, once Mary gives birth to him, she puts him into a manger. And a manger is not a stable, it's a feeding trough. And so where would you find feeding troughs? Well, you would find them, in barnyards. You'd find them, yes, also in stables, in alleyways, caves, out in the fields, those sorts of things. And so, I would say that the nativities, the Christmas story, is very much a combination of Matthew, Luke, and also the proto-gospel. So the proto-evangelium has the story of Mary riding into Bethlehem, taking her journey on a donkey. There is no donkey in the Gospel of Luke. Then Mary and Joseph are just traveling. There's no barnyard animals. Those things all are provided by the reader's imagination. But they combine in such a way to give us this very kind of iconic scene that really, even if you didn't grow up going to church, you recognize this scene, right? These are the wise men or the kings or whatever. There's the shepherds over here. There's the star. There's the stable. People kind of know what's going on because that's part of cultural consciousness. But in terms of where that appears in the New Testament, that scene does not appear anywhere in the New Testament.
Gotcha. All right. Last one for me today. If
Okay.
these texts were that influential and widely read, what does it say about how we define scripture and who got to decide what counted and what did not?
Well, that comes back to that question of the process of canonization. And, I think it's a very organic process. And I think that it is a process that, in the second and third centuries and the 100s and 200s, that process is still ongoing. Even in the 4th century, one of the earliest examples that we have of a major early Christian thinker, that is Athanasius, he writes a festal letter, 367, I think. It's like, I'm sorry, I'm bad with dates and bad with numbers, but he writes this letter in which he says, these are the texts that you should be reading. But interestingly, in this letter, he also mentions other texts, like he mentions the Epistle of Barnabas, and I think even the Shepherd of Hermas, right? These are these texts that he's like, yeah, you can read these, just don't read them publicly. And so, and then when we look at old copies of the New Testament, we also have these texts that are in those collections. And so the process of deciding what's in the New Testament, what's not, that's a process that's still going on in the 4th century. And it's all, quite frankly, it's a process that continues through the medieval period. This idea that a group of people in what I hear a lot is the question about Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea. Is that where these texts were just decided? And a lot of people will say, didn't they just choose these texts because these are the texts that made Jesus out to be a certain way? No, they didn't. I mean, they were there to answer different questions. But it really isn't even until like the 1500s that we get at the Council of Trent a acknowledgement or sort of a closing of the canon. These are the only texts that are in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that comes in response to the Protestant Reformation, where you had Martin Luther, who was saying, yeah, the New Testament is great, except for Revelation and James. I don't care for those very much, so I'm going to put those in appendix. But that shows that even in the early 1500s, with somebody like Martin Luther, who was not an unpious person, even then, there was a sort of sense that, what's in this collection needs to reflect belief and worship and practice. And so, it kind of, it's a process that I think goes on for centuries. And then today, of course, the conversation has shifted to, well, inspiration, authority, all of those sorts of things. Can you learn things from the Proto-Gospel of James? Absolutely. There's a lot of really rich theological ideas in the Proto-Gospel. Can you learn things from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas? Absolutely. But those texts existing outside of the canon is sort of a statement that the texts inside the New Testament are uniquely inspired, or uniquely, I don't like the word inspired very much because I don't think people know what it means, but uniquely inspired or uniquely authoritative, whereas these other texts might be interesting, maybe even good for the soul, but they aren't uniquely inspired or authoritative like those other texts are.
Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel, thank you so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.